Good morning and welcome to your Umatilla Conversation. This morning we have the Finance Director, Robert Pahl, with us to answer some questions on the budget process, and just some odds and ends that end up being questions throughout the year on how the budget process proceeds and how it mechanically works. So welcome this morning, Robert.
Good morning.
And the Umatilla Conversation, as we started with the first one, is an outreach to each of our department heads to begin with to help explain how Umatilla County operates and how it goes through its day-to-day business, also with how we establish kind of our long-range goals and how we look to the future. So you get to be the first department head, Robert, and welcome. And so let's just jump right in. The proposed 24 budget is in the $136 million range. Can you go through how that budget is put together, your department, how you work with other staff, and kind of the finance process, and then maybe even touch on some of the procurement processes. But go ahead and jump right in and kind of just give us a background on how your department works, how many staff, and that kind of information.
Okay, so we'll start with my department. There are currently 5 people in my department. However, one of those is an overfill to train for a longtime employee who's going to be retiring. So generally we have 4 people. We have a dedicated accounts payable clerk, and we have another person who is more in charge of our fleet, but does some accounts payable and some accounts receivable. And then there is an assistant to me who works with the general ledger and bank reconciliations and things of that nature. And I oversee that as well as work in all of those areas. The budget.
Just a second. Going back to a fill-in person, it seems to me like anybody in your department, like all departments, but trying to replace somebody that has institutional knowledge and history, that's got to be a tough position to fill.
Yeah, I was really concerned that we would have extreme difficulty in filling that position. However, we very fortunately found someone who I think is going to fill that role and has the potential to be a really good addition to our team and to the county staff.
That's really good news. Really good news. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt, Robert. Go ahead with kind of the finance process.
So start with budget. You mentioned that earlier. The budget process is ongoing in our office, but we generally distribute how we are doing so far to all of the departments in mid-December, to allow them to start to prepare a budget for the following fiscal year, which begins July 1. That involves previous budget amounts, previous amounts spent the last couple of years, and where they are year to date. During that process, some of them will come to me and ask, what's this look like, or can you give me some advice? Other departments make their own adjustments as to what they think they'll be spending the next fiscal year. And we collect those all up in January and go through them with a fine-tooth comb and try and determine whether we have numbers that are going to work for the next year. And then we contact departments to make adjustments as needed. And then we work on balancing the budget. So we have a lot of different departments, a lot of different programs. Some of those are completely self-funded through either the state or federal funding, and the county taxes and other things don't really fund those. Like that might be the road department, might be our DD department. Those departments are fully funded by other sources. And then we have a lot of departments, Board of Commissioners, Finance Department, HR, and a number of other departments that have a conglomeration of funding. They have property taxes as a big piece of some of those, and then sometimes fees or grants to cover some of that. But But there are a number of those. So we balance the budget. So what we do is project what we're going to receive for property taxes, and we project the revenues that have been kind of estimated by the departments, and come to a place where we know that we're going to have enough money to perform those services for the following year. Occasionally that requires us to make cuts. Other years it doesn't. This year we didn't have to make any cuts to our budget. We were in a position where we didn't need to do that. So by that time we put that budget together, we send it out to all the departments just so they know what they're looking at in case we miss something or there's changes they want to make. And then upcoming, really, around the corner is our annual budget meetings with that we'll have in April, this month. We have those meetings. They're open to the public. That starts, I want to say it's 21st and 20th. It's either the 20th and 21st or 21st and 22nd. I
think it's the 21st, 22nd.
I don't have my calendar in front of me. So we'll discuss those. They're open to the public. The departments will present their budget to the budget committee, which consists of 3 people from the community as well as the 3 commissioners. And they take an assessment of what they hear, and in most cases they understand, and we occasionally make changes during that meeting, but it's kind of based on public input and the budget committee's wishes. So
going back to the budget process for just a second, one of the things that I guess I was surprised and learned as coming in as a new commissioner, I knew it was there, but to the degree I wasn't familiar. I can think of just sitting here right now, probably 10 different influences on our budgets just in the grants and awards areas. And I'm sure it's much bigger than that if I went back through my budget process. It is astounding to me how complicated that becomes quickly. Yeah, whether it be a grant from the emergency department or a grant on top of an original grant at Umatilla County Health, just tracking that and the interaction with the departments and your offices and your office kind of taking the lead on making sure that gets recorded correctly and all of that. I don't think the general public understands how much money comes in and out, especially at the state level from the state, but from other groups, whether it be the BMIP money that comes in to the commissioners, or it's not as much, but it seems to be larger when it's federal dollars, and not as much, especially post-pandemic. But I just don't know how. I mean, you make it look smooth. You make it look just seamless. And how that happens, I walk in, ask a question, and somebody in there has an answer every time. And I don't know how you guys get to that point. I'd like to hear how you guys kind of thumb through that grant program, because it's a huge part of our budget.
I would say it's a learning experience every day.
And for me, for sure.
And years of experience has been helpful. Just invaluable has been my long-term assistant, Marie. She knows things. She has historical, institutional knowledge that's really helpful. A budget, as I've always said, is a plan and is subject to change. And when we develop the budget, there are some things that we have a pretty good idea of. There's other things that we don't. State funding, federal funding are 2 of those items that are fairly big variables. They're a huge part of our budget. When there's a cut at the state level, that impacts things. When there are new grants at the state level, that impacts things. Really, you have to be really conservative, because what we don't want to do is end up in a place where we're short. And so we try not to count count our chickens before they're hatched. And so I have a very conservative approach to creating the budget and talking to departments about, occasionally someone will say, oh, I think we're going to get this grant. And then, so we have to discuss how likely is that?
Yeah.
And okay, so you may think you're going to get this grant, but I don't think we're going to plan to spend it until we know. And I think the other piece is that our department heads have a really good handle on things at the state level. I think of Dale in Community Corrections. I mean, he's got a constant finger on the pulse of what his funding is going to be going forward. And so you get a level of confidence. And then, like I said, it's a plan. And if anybody makes plans, you realize that eventually you have to change them because things that you thought were going to happen don't happen. So kind of brings me to budget adjustments.
Sure.
So in a general year, we might do 80 or 90 budget adjustments to our programs, which relates to funding changes. And when there are funding changes, like our health department is a really good example. Their funding is quite a bit of state money and some federal money, and their grants are not set in stone year by year. I mean, there are grants that come out throughout the year, and so they might get a grant for, say, tobacco control cessation. Well, they don't have a person to do that job, but they have a grant, so then they have to hire somebody new. So we have to then adjust our budget to reflect that. And so there's a public process so that the community knows that we've increased our budget. But those kinds of things happen on a regular basis with the plan because the plan changes.
Yeah, and like I learned my first year here is we don't spend money we don't have. And I think that's a good commissioner position to be in because I can think of at least one grant out there that we were promised we were going to get in January that we haven't seen yet. And if we would have pre-spent that money or pre-authorized the spend of that money, I think that as commissioners we would be creating an expectation for the receivers that really isn't true until that's in hand.
Absolutely, and even, when you get commitments from either the federal government or the state, sometimes that doesn't necessarily come in the same schedule they might have given it to you. And so it's really important to be careful to not spend what you don't have.
Yep.
One of the key things, don't spend what you don't have, and always know there's going to be unexpected needs.
Yeah, and that more often than you really hope for, but yes, that's true. You went through kind of the finance process and the budget. How do we establish, or what is established that comes before the board for expenses? I think one of the questions I get is how is that established? Who establishes it? And why some things come before the board and other things don't?
So we have several fiscal policies in place, which are all either more stringent than the state regulations for purchasing. And one of our policies is the amount that individuals can spend without approval of someone of greater authority. And so departments can generally spend up to $3,000 on a single purchase without additional approval. So that's by the approval of the department head. And those are items that are in their budget, but we just kind of want to monitor those larger purchases to be sure that we're getting a good deal, that we're not being, frivolous with our money. And then between $3,000 and $5,000, my office reviews those purchases, and that's just the policy set up. And then anything over $5,000 is forwarded to the commissioners for their approval. There are cases where that's not strictly true. For instance, our road department routinely spends far more money than that, but there are routine expenditures. Gravel, asphalt is $20,000-$30,000 for a truckload of asphalt. That's routine. They do that all the time, and we know and they actually contract for that and go through a bid process, so we know that that's okay ahead of time.
And even with that said, a lot of those contracts, or I'm going to say the majority of those contracts, whether it be health or road department or even the sheriff's department, those contracts actually come to the commissioner so that we're aware of them. And I think that when they're presented by both the department heads and the finance department, you get just a better picture, and even sometimes legal on the bidding process. You get such a bigger picture of what the process is. When I came in, I didn't have a clue what went on at the health department, pretty up to speed at the road department. Now I at least have a peripheral view of what goes on at the health department and how they achieve their goals that they get to set individually, and especially on the finance side. One of the reasons invited you for this first conversation, Umatilla County conversation, is finance really is kind of the pivot point in Umatilla County. Everything kind of drives around that, and I think that your explanation of the budget process today, as we right in the middle of it, and we have the budget review committee. Again, those are citizen appointments, and nominated and then brought to the commissioners for appointment, along with the budget committee, the compensation committee. All of those are done outside of the commissioner's office until the end process. And I guess that's really where we are on the 21st and 22nd is explain kind of how that process works, those 2 days of department heads coming in.
So, like I said, those are public meetings, and we schedule them to go through each department in the budget. So there's 80 plus departments within the county. I lost count a long time ago. And so whoever's in charge of those departments gives a brief synopsis of what the department's doing and whether they've changed operations from the year before. And that's in front of, as I said before, the Board of Commissioners, and then 3 members of the community that they're appointed to the Budget Committee and are given that information somewhat ahead of time. So they've all had a chance to look at a copy of the proposed budget already, that they've had a chance to prepare. We have some really, I would say, dedicated individuals on that group. They take it seriously. And so they listen to those presentations. They ask a lot of questions. They get a lot of good answers. And by that point, I would say, I've asked a lot of those questions already, so I know kind of what the answers should be. There's not a lot of fluff by that point. But certainly members of the public I actually think it'll be online, but they're also welcome to attend and listen. At that point, the budget committee and the commissioners, they make some decisions. They make some decisions on what elected official compensation is going to be. There's a process for that. They make a decision on what the tax rate's going to be going forward and what the total budget is going to be. And then later in the spring, actually in early June, the commissioners will then formally adopt that budget so that we can begin spending those funds July 1st.
Yeah, I think that's the important part that I was hoping that you'd bring up, is that gap between the April budget hearings, which are mandatory and statutory, and then the statutory adoption of the budget itself. Our budget ends the end of June, begins July.
Yes.
And there's a lot of departments that have to have that go forward plan in place before the end of June. And I think that process, I've learned that process is very professional, very coordinated, and done with great intention and deliberation, and I appreciate that. So we're coming to the end of our time with Robert Pahl, our Director of Finance here at Umatilla County, and thank you very much for taking the time this morning. I know it's a busy time for you, and I appreciate it. And Lori, behind the camera, thank you for all your work today. And we're going to go ahead and conclude today's Umatilla County conversation. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Dan.